Well, good morning. If we are serious about reform during this legislative session, then we as legislators need to take a good hard look in the mirror. In the last year, the Minnesota Legislature has been more dysfunctional than a Kardashian marriage. And before legislators start targeting other people in state government, local government, or in the private sector for reform, we need to put our own houses in order. The extreme partisanship, the scandals, the government shutdown, all start to make the Minnesota Legislature look like Congress. And that is not a move that is helpful for the state of Minnesota, and it's certainly not what voters expect from us. Today we're announcing a set of reforms that the House DFL is pursuing and pushing for this legislative session, but we're not pushing it as a partisan matter. These are reforms that authors on both parties have supported in the past, and we hope will support again in the future. We hope that there is still time in this legislative session to change the tone, to start doing our work the way the people expect us to do our work, and actually leave the state and leave this legislature better than it was when we started in this session. The bill that we're introducing so far has 21 authors in the House. We have Senate authors underway, and we are hoping for bipartisanship in the end. We include the following, at least as a starting point for legislative reform. We need to disclose how legislators earn their money. Right now, Minnesota has one of the worst income disclosure rules in the country. Louisiana is the best. Minnesota is among the worst. That should give us some real concern. As legislators, we disclose who our employers are, but we don't have to disclose how we make money as consultants. And we also don't have to disclose how our spouses make money. So if I'm a legislator and I want to take money from some unsavory source, all I have to do is claim that I'm a consultant, issue a invoice for the services, and I can take the money and nobody would ever know about it. That's unacceptable. We also have a problem with the legislature in the last year with too much influence from state political parties on the process. One of the reforms in this bill would prohibit state party officers from serving as legislative staff. During the state government shutdown, one of the worst abuses of the legislative process were extensive meetings and negotiations taking place behind closed doors, which is okay, because sometimes that's how negotiations have to happen. But the worst part was that the state capitol building was closed. We couldn't even come in. I actually tried to come in one day, and I brought my 3 kids with me because they were out of daycare for the day, and I was barred by Capitol security from coming in as a legislator. And certainly the public was not welcome. So this bill does 2 things in that regard. It prohibits the governor from meeting with legislative leaders if the Capitol building is closed, and it prohibits the legislature from taking action between midnight and 7 a.m. That actually is a substantial change. The legislature also is exempt from the Data Practices Act in Minnesota. And it may not be a good idea for the legislature to pass a law that a governor signs and not be able to change that law in the future with regard to data practices because there are separation of powers issues. But at the very least, the legislature should have to have a policy on record retention and data practices. Right now we have a question about personnel issues in the state Senate, and there is no law, there is no protection, there is no guidance even for how personnel data should be considered or treated at the Minnesota Legislature. We've also have a number of additional changes in this bill related to redistricting, legislative compensation, and other issues, state government shutdown, to stop that from happening in the future, and really trying to address some of the serious problems that this legislature has had in the last year. It is time for us to put our own house in order before we start telling the rest of Minnesota how they should conduct their business. So with that, I don't know if Paul or anybody else has comments.
Let me just go to some questions.
Questions?
You have any Republicans?
Not yet, but we're working on it. A lot of the provisions in this bill, for example, redistricting commission, have had bipartisan support in the past, and I think disclosure of legislative income, that's not a partisan issue, not even close. So I'm hoping to get Republican authors. We've had Republican support for these kind of provisions in the past. And, it's been a tough first week at the legislature on from a partisanship perspective. And I'm hoping that we have still time to turn this around and actually do something positive.
Will you talk a little bit about that? How does something like this go forward, which affects legislators directly? How does something like this go forward with the tone now that we've seen in the last week?
Well, I think it's time for legislators to actually take a breath and think about what our job is, think about what the public expects us to do, and try to actually make our own legislative bodies work, make the legislature work. I think there's going to be a big political price to be paid for anybody who wants to run for re-election in a kind of hyper-partisan, highly charged emotional atmosphere here where nothing gets done. I think we all need to take a deep breath, cool down, and see if we can't find some way of working together to actually do something good for the state.
Is it fair to say over the last couple of years Minnesotans don't think this government works?
Well, if you look at recent polling, Minnesotans have a low opinion of the state legislature, a little better than Congress, but a low opinion of the legislature, and generally speaking, the people are pretty smart about those things. I think they're right.
You think that people are, in a lot of those polls, they always say, well, I think that the legislature or Congress are not effective, but I really like my legislator. You think that's changing, and you think the bipartisan, there was a lot of talk in that preliminary meeting in room 15 where everyone shook hands, it was all kind of joyous. Do you think that bipartisan atmosphere is different now?
Well, I think I just saw a poll recently that said if you could unseat all members of Congress, including your own, would you do so? And it had something like 64% approving of that position. So I do think there is a sense that people are getting so frustrated with how we conduct business and what's going on both at the legislature and at Congress that they're starting to reconsider their own legislators. And in the end, does it mean that everyone's going to get unseated? Very likely not. But the kind of hyper-partisanship and the nasty tone that's been set so far is not going to improve any of that, and I think is dangerous for all incumbents.
Well, and also just in particular in comparison with what Minnesotans really care about right now. I mean, there's all this fighting going on here when in their everyday lives they're worrying about paying the mortgage, they're worrying about whether they're going to have their job next week still. Those are the things people care about, and the path out is fixing our own shop and then focusing on those issues.
Mr. Leader, what do you think about being in session for 1 week and now you're going to take a break for a week?
Well, we have precinct caucuses and people need to get back for those precinct caucuses. You're right, and we would have been off on Friday. I mean, would it have been our choice to take that extended length of vacation? I don't know, but it is what it is.
Well, you're talking about getting down to work here, and the governor said yesterday it doesn't look like you're working.
Well, no, I mean,
I
I think if it would have been up to many of our members, that's not, again, the choice we would have made, but we will be back, and I hope, more importantly than whether we take a few days off is when the next couple days as we lead into that, we're going to see some very hyper-partisan issues coming up on the floor of the House, which I think is unfortunate. Hopefully when we get back from precinct caucuses and people have heard from their constituents about what really matters to them, because that's what precinct caucuses really ought to be about, we'll actually get back down to work and focus in on jobs and the middle-class economy, which is what people really care about.
How important is it that resolution in the Rules Committee today to halt the per diem during the break?
I don't think it's going to be highly controversial.
I'd like to say something on just the reform bill that Representative Winkler brought forward. And I applaud his efforts. He has put a lot of thought into this reform bill. It is true government reform. It is real government reform. And it's real government reform that the citizens of Minnesota, in my opinion, have been looking and crying for. And I think it brings truth and transparency and openness back to government, back to state government. And as he has brought forth a number of the issues that are in this piece of legislation, I hope that all of us, in a bipartisan way, grab onto this and get it passed into legislation, get it signed, so that it brings back the citizens of Minnesota, so it helps the citizens of Minnesota once again feel comfortable with their state government. Once again, they know the openness, the honesty, the truth that is trying to be sought out here. So I really applaud Representative Winkler's efforts, and I am proud to be a co-sponsor, co-author of the bill in an attempt to bring back to the citizens of Minnesota, clarity, openness, truth, trustworthy, honesty to state government that has been, questionable. So I really applaud his efforts, and thank you, Representative Winkler.
Representative Winkler, would you prohibit legislative sessions after midnight?
Yes,
Okay.
between midnight and 7 a.m.
Okay.
I don't know how many of you have spent the night here with us. I know that TV coverage makes that less necessary, but for those of you who have spent the night on the House floor watching us, we're not at our best at 4 a.m., surprisingly. and the room starts to take on a little different odor and a little different appearance, and it is really not a good time to make big decisions.
And on the disclosure, would that require lawyers to disclose their clients?
It would not require lawyers to disclose clients. Generally speaking, a lawyer is employed by a law firm, and so then you'd have to disclose the law firm as your employer.
Would it apply to everyone who has to file the statement of economic interest, including the executive branch candidates?
Yes, it would apply to everyone who's filed the statement of economic interest. Okay. Although I think the legislature is really where that issue is the biggest. Although, we have seen legislators getting paid for doing political work and candidates for the legislature getting paid for doing political work. So, if it doesn't apply to candidates, it's a loophole that we, I think, need to close.
What about the term reform? Republicans stood here all together as a caucus with the big Reform 2.0 sign. Are you trying to piggyback or react to their use of the word reform here and their priority?
I think reform means do things better, and it's a word that's been used a lot, but the Reform 2.0 proposal Republicans put forward is basically a rehash of their old partisan agenda, and there are a few things that I think are a common ground that we can agree on, but generally speaking, reform I think is intended to be kind of bipartisan or nonpartisan, trying to focus on the facts, and their proposal I think fell far short of that. And this proposal, I'm not going to get into a semantic debate about what is reform. I don't really know that the public is too worried about that. I think they just want us to do a better job.
Could this be folded into their effort, though, so that you can get the majority to champion it?
We could call this Reform 2.1 if they really wanted to. Whatever they want to do for branding's sake in order to make the legislature work better, I'm on board with.
Is there a top item here, Representative?
A top item?
Yeah.
That's a tough question. I think the economic disclosure is probably the most important. That's where Minnesota has fallen furthest behind other states. It is an embarrassment that the state of Louisiana has better disclosure about its legislators' sources of income than the state of Minnesota, and very contrary to what we would expect. And I think there's a chance that in the next few days the Campaign Finance Board may reveal that there is a significant loophole in that regard. So that is probably the one small thing that would make the biggest difference. There is a provision in here related to state government shutdowns, which probably in the long run has the biggest impact, but is also probably the hardest to get passed.
Where are shutdowns and redistricting commission? You mentioned two things that aren't on the list.
Oh, well, I don't know. I can get you a full list or a copy of the bill. But there are additional provisions. I don't think we listed everything on there.
What are you doing about shutdowns? That sounds interesting.
Well, continuing appropriation so that the legislature doesn't pass bills, so that the government continues functioning. And the only provision in there that is novel probably is that if we're running a deficit, the deficit would be made up by a 50% across the board spending cuts and 50% income tax surcharge. So basically, taking pain from both sides in order to cover any kind of deficit that's ongoing in the event of a shutdown.
That's in this bill.
Yes.
Continuing appropriations at 100%?
No, continuing it depends. Okay. Well, I'm talking to you though. This is not the focus. I think there will be lots of people presenting bills related to preventing a government shutdown.
But while you're talking to them, answer my question, please. What percentage?
Well, the proposal that I have in this bill as a starting point is that appropriations can continue if the state is running a budget deficit as a result of the shutdown. The deficit would be made up or would be covered by a 50%, half of it would be covered by across-the-board spending cuts, and half of it would be made up with across-the-board income tax surcharge. And I'll keep looking at you. And then if they're running a surplus, then surplus dollars that are coming in would go into the reserves. So it's basically, as much as possible, try to limit the discretion, eliminate the game playing, eliminate the sense of one party trying to game the system against the other, and basically say, if you want to make changes to law, you have to get together and make a compromise, and you're not going to hold the state of Minnesota and its citizens hostage in the meantime.
It'd still be 100% funding.
No, no. If you're running a deficit, it would be half the deficit would be would be spending cuts.
The deficit, without a deficit, you'd be at 100% funding. By definition, if you have a deficit, you're not at 100% funding.
Yeah.
I have a question about the record retention. You mentioned something about the recent personnel issue, which is there not a procedure and policy, as we have in the private sector and other public sectors of government, that requires that in a personnel matter?
There is no law that applies to the legislature and how it treats personnel matters. The courts could apply law from other sectors, and they could say it should also apply to the legislature. But generally speaking, the legislature's document retention, personnel records, all those kinds of things are at the discretion of the legislature. Full discretion, I would say.
Just quickly, you've got redistricting commission in this bill?
Yes.
And that is to have an independent commission do redistricting
Right.
next time around,
Yes.
I presume.
Yes, there's also a compensation council.
I'm going to try to fit it in right now.
Yeah. Theory, well, that wouldn't obviously apply now. But, I mean, the legislature shouldn't be able to draw its own district lines, the legislature shouldn't be able to set its own salary, and the legislature shouldn't be able to hold the state of Minnesota hostage because it doesn't want to compromise and get the job done. Those are 3 parts of the bill that are also in there. There's a number of provisions. We kind of highlighted the ones we thought were most interesting for the release.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.